All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last session of day 2 of NDC. Make sure you're in the right place. I like that enthusiasm. I always hate being the one before the attendee party because everyone's probably downstairs just warming themselves up before all the festivities. This is my first time in London, my first time in the UK, my first NDC. I'm very excited to be here. Those who have never seen me before, my name's Kevin. I'm from the great land of the United States of America, specifically the Norfolk, Virginia area. So a little fact, if you're not familiar with the United States, that's fine. Virginia is home to Norfolk, which is the world's largest naval base. So that's the little thing about the area that I live in. Other things. I'm a Microsoft MVP. My focus has always been in ASP.NET, building web applications and deploying stuff to Microsoft Azure. I'm independent consultant and trainer. So if you ever want to talk about stuff afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to you. I'm always on Twitter, and you can always email me. And I'll put this up at the end if you want to. But today we're going to talk about building client applications for the web, specifically with an ASP.NET backend, or ASP.NET Core backend. So kind of a raise of hands, who's been developing web applications with ASP.NET since the early web form days? All right, that's a good number of folks. Who's developed with Razor? All right, awesome. Who's developed with just raw HTML and JavaScript and they talk to a .NET backend? All right, not as many hands. So we've seen this progression of how we as .NET developers build web applications on top of ASP.NET. And we really, if I had more time, I'd do a whole history lesson. But I love web forms. I started as a web forms developer, quickly moved to MVC when that became a thing in the 1.0 days. But I love web forms because web forms had one single fundamental job, and that was to convert WinForm developers to web developers. So if you developed anything with ASP.NET Web Forms 1.1, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You were just being converted to a different type of developer. And all the tools were there. Everything was click, drag, and drop. You could see what you were rendering. And the code underneath looked awful. Like, we were not developing in JavaScript. We were developing everything in .NET, C#, VB if you were unlucky. And you were spitting out HTML that looked horrendous. We made tons of mistakes, and we were looking for a better way to do things, especially with JavaScript libraries and frameworks becoming more prevalent. Moved to MVC, we got our hands on Razor, and Razor was a little bit more of a systematic approach to writing HTML, but still sprinkling in the bits of C# that we really liked. So you would get a rendered output that was pure HTML, and you could relate that directly back to where you wrote the code in a Razor page. But then we have this new idea of just raw HTML, JavaScript, and just having APIs as our backends that we can send data to or get data from. And that's what we're going to really concentrate on today. I have done this talk 3 different times, and each of those 3 times, I hated it. It was a horrible, horrible presentation. So I took all the lessons I learned from giving this presentation before. I rewrote the entire the entire presentation. So you're getting V2 of this presentation, which I feel is much better. It's got probably 40 more slides. It's more discussion, questions I have asked along the way, figuring out how to build single-page applications with .NET backends. But the terms Vue, Vue.JS, you can really substitute that for Angular or for React. I have built major production applications in all 3 of these technologies, or all 50 of these technologies if you count every version of Angular. But if I had to really pick what I like, I'd go with Vue every single time. And that's not because it's the latest, greatest thing that everyone's trying to use. Is that I fundamentally believe it is a better technology than the other 2 put together. I don't say that lightly. All these technologies are great, they do their job, but I would rank it Vue, then React, and then Angular.js, which was amazing, and then they got rid of it and wrote Angular 2. And one thing you'll learn about me, I'm opinionated. I have a ton of opinions, and I'll gladly talk about them over a pint. But we have these new ways of developing web applications, and it doesn't matter which of these technologies you're using, they all kind of have the same fundamentals. Number one, they're all CLI-based, so command line interfaces. If you want true success with any of these client-side technologies, you're using a CLI, because Angular, in particular, is horrible if you try to go off the script. React works slightly better if you try to go off the script. Vue will work perfectly for just simple applications, but if you're building a SPA, a single-page application, you want to use the Vue CLI. They just give you all the tools, they do all the work for you. Our whole development and deployment process happens outside of our backend. So if I'm building an API that serves up data or handles things like talking to a database, that development is completely separate. So I have two applications that I'm technically managing, which is slightly different from the way that we did things with web forms or with Razor pages. Because you're used to everything being in the same solution, one instance of Visual Studio, and everything was in one place. Now, I have one editor that's just my front end, and I have another editor that's all my back end. Our front end doesn't care where it gets data from, so if I'm loading up a view that's a list of users, well, Vue, Angular, React, doesn't care where that data is coming from. It can go to an ASP.NET core backend, it can go to a serverless function, Lambda, or Azure functions. It doesn't matter. Oh, I switched up my thing. It doesn't, so the front end doesn't care where it's served from. What I mean by that is it doesn't have to be served up by an ASP.NET application. It doesn't need to be served up by, we could just put in blob storage up in Azure. We can put in an S3 container. We can put our front end anywhere because it's just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So I asked myself this question a couple years ago. Making the move to ASP.NET Core, what was the most efficient way to build a web application that would utilize the best parts of ASP.NET Core, but also the best parts of whatever client library I was using, and eventually coming to Vue.js. So along this way, I have made a ton of mistakes in all three technologies. I've landed on the best possible solution that I can think of, and that is Vue.js with a .NET Core backend. And what we'll do is we'll talk about my progression of what questions I asked to get to the solution and just giving you the answer so you don't have to do this research yourself. All right. A couple quick goals of this talk. Talk about my approach. Tell you the questions I've asked myself and give you the answers. I'm going to talk about a lot of tools. Use this for something. Use that for something else. I want to tell you why I'm telling you to use these particular tools, not just telling you, go use Vuex because that's good for state management. I want to explain why that's something you need to know. You will not learn everything you need to know about Vue.js or ASP.NET Core. If you don't already know Vue, you'll still get something out of this talk. I'll show you enough Vue where you'll be comfortable with the concepts, but it's not like at the end of this talk, you're going to go write a full-scale Vue application. You still have to do a little bit of that work yourself. All right, so let's talk about the architecture of a single-page application. It's not a new concept. It's been around for several years. I actually wrote a single-page app a long, long time ago in 2007 using ASP.NET Web Forms and using an update panel. Is that a blast to the past for anyone? And it worked horribly. It worked really well at the time in 2007. I sat back and went, I am a genius. This works amazingly. And now in 2020, I go, that was some awful code. I should have been fired on the spot. I don't know why we deployed that. But the architecture of a single page application looks something like this. Again, it's two applications. on the left side, our ASP.NET Core app is going to be our backend. And this has three main responsibilities. It can have more, it could have less. Number one is just data access. If I'm talking to a database, SQL Server, Postgres, Cosmos, you name it, I'm going to go through this backend to get access to that data. Then my core application is also responsible for authentication and authorization. We'll talk more about this in a couple minutes. But if I'm going to access any of this data, I want to make sure I'm going through the correct firewalls. Do I have permission to do the actions that I want to do? On the right side, I have my front end, my Vue.js app. And this is responsible for just showing things to the user. This is my UI. And a couple big things it will be responsible for: routing, or more importantly, what should I show the user based off what's in the address bar. State management. So if I'm running a single page app, I'm not constantly going back to the server to load new HTML. Like in a Razor page, I'm not going back to the server to load new HTML every single time. I'll have all the HTML I need. I just need to know which HTML to show, and then go to the server to get data and load that data into the page. And then my Vue.js app will have to figure out how does it go talk back to the ASP.NET Core app to get data or to post new data. And I call that data fetching, or AJAX from the olden days. All right, so question number one, before we get started, what do you need to know about Vue, assuming you have no Vue experience? Number one, Vue is a client-side app for building web application frameworks. Just like Angular, just like React. Heck, it's just like jQuery. I mean, they all do fundamentally the same thing, just a little bit differently. It's based on components, and not web components, which is a buzzword right now because that's the way the web will eventually want to go. But this is a component, or an idea of component. And it has three fundamental parts: the template, the HTML that we're going to render on the page, any styles associated with that HTML on the page, and the JavaScript, the code that makes that template work. It's almost like a Razor page, or more like a web form. So a web form, you have your front end, and you have your code behind. And this makes up one single fundamental component. What's unique about something like this, it's all self-contained. When this gets deployed, this is the HTML for the component, the code for the component, and you can even scope the styles to that particular component. So you don't have any issues with maybe CSS conflicting with something else on the page. So then this one component can get reused wherever you need it to. It's shipped as one single thing. All right. And Vue is limited opinion. We'll touch on this a little bit more in a moment, but Vue is going to do as little or as much as you want it to do. So when I say limited opinion, in this example, this Vue component does nothing. It's just rendering some HTML on the page. But I could set this up to do two-way binding between data inside my code and elements in my template. It'll do that stuff for me. But it won't do things like AJAX requests for you. But we'll come back to that. How do you set up a Vue app? This goes back to our CLI conversation a moment ago. And the reason I put it in the slide deck is because you have to make some big decisions setting up your app initially, that if you don't do it, it's a little bit of a headache to go back and fix it. So first you install the CLI. It's JavaScript, so you have NPM, or you have Yarn. Anyone use Yarn? One guy? Okay, well, that's about what I see. Most people use NPM because we always have it installed. Install the CLI, and then you can use the Vue command. Oh, why would we use the CLI? A couple big things. You don't have to use the CLI for Vue specifically. you can use it sort of the same way we would use jQuery. Drop it on the page, write a little bit of code, everything works. But when we start writing single-page applications, there's a lot more to an app than just writing a little bit of JavaScript. So I'll show you an example when we're all done of a full sample app. But you don't want to write a single-page app framework by hand. You'd rather that be done for you. That's what the CLI does. The scaffolding is the nice part. Having not to scaffold out all these different bits and pieces helps a ton. But the big thing is really with upgrades. And there's hot reload. Hot reload is like way down the list of benefits. So if you update the code, wait a second, your page will refresh because the development server is linked to your browser and knows whenever you update a component, maybe you change some HTML, you change some JavaScript, it updates the page. This is the big one. This is why I would tell anyone to use the CLI is because this is open source, it's continuously being upgraded. So not just point releases, but every now and then a major release. And I have learned this lesson the hard way, specifically with React. I created a React app and said to myself, all right, CLI is good, but I'm better than the CLI, so I'm going to what they call eject the app from the React CLI. So what it does is it just gives you all the configuration, all the code, and you can go in and you can maintain that stuff yourself. Because I said, I am smarter than the tool. You're never smarter than the tool. Because what happened? React got a major upgrade. I said, okay, well this should be easy. Go into my NPM stuff and I'll just change the versions and everything will be great. I'll have to fix a little bit of code. No, the upgrade required an upgrade of Webpack. Now, if you've never heard of Webpack, it's this really cool tool that compiles and makes all your code really small and tidy, but its configuration is a pain in the butt. Who's ever worked with Webpack directly? Okay, 1 to 2 hands. So I would hope you agree with me. Webpack is awful to configure by hand. So I had to basically go from Webpack, what, 3 to 4 or 2 to 3? I don't remember which it was, but I couldn't do it, physically couldn't do it, because the dependencies of Webpack and every little change I had to make kept making the application worse. It just wouldn't work at all. So we hit this point where we physically could not upgrade the application because we couldn't figure out how. And it wasn't worth our time trying to figure it out. Eventually, we brought the entire application back into the React CLI framework just so we could do upgrades. But it was 10 seconds of effort to take it out. It was 10 hours of effort to put it back in. So no, ever eject from your CLI. Leave it in the CLI until the end of time. When you use the CLI, you'll say Vue create, and you'll give your application a fancy name. Make sure it's all lowercase, or else it will yell at you. And there are some presets that you'll get by default. I never use the presets when creating a new application, just because it's so much fun to go through the wizard. So let's assume we manually select features instead. It's going to ask you a bunch of things that you might want to put into your CLI. Use Babel by default. Babel is useful if you're supporting older browsers. Anyone have to support Internet Explorer 11? Really? Holy crap. If I was in the States, every hand would be up right now. I need to move here. TypeScript, anyone using TypeScript? A couple of hands? All right, so if you prefer TypeScript, it can scaffold the entire thing in TypeScript. If you're supporting one of PWA for any operating system that supports it, you can get that built in automatically. But for our cases, you'll probably want the router for actually making a single page app. You want Vuex for state management, which we'll talk about. CSS preprocessors, you probably don't necessarily need. You can always add them in later if you need them. You'll want the linter or the formatter. This is really useful just for double checking your JavaScript or your TypeScript, making sure you're writing it correctly. And you don't need unit testing because that's a fad. I'm glad you're all chuckling. Sometimes I do that and I just offend people. What type of ESLint you want, it doesn't matter. I just select error prevention only. Lint on save, yeah, this is all just silly things. Oh, this is a big one. Put all your configuration into dedicated files. I don't even know why they asked this. This should be default no matter what, but you could put configuration into your package.json file, but then it's harder to configure. I like dedicated config files just because you'll find yourself wanting to make adjustments to ESLint or Vue in particular. It's just easier this way. It does a whole bunch of magic. I used to do this demo live and realized, depending on internet, it can take 5 minutes. So I skipped that part. And when you're all done, you get fancy new directory. All right. Now, to run it, you go in, you say npm serve, and this generates what we call the development build of the application and runs the development server. So you can go to localhost, whatever the port is, and it will show you the current application running. You could then load the application up in, say, VS Code or whatever your editor is of choice and make adjustments. Every time you hit save on a file, it will recompile and automatically update the page that you're currently looking at. All right. And there's also some tools for specifically editing Vue.js. If we have time, I'll show those. But rest assured, you get source mapping. So any code that you write, it's going to get compiled. So the compiled output is ugly, hard to read, but with source mapping, you can edit it just like it's inside your editor. All right. And this is what the default app looks like, nothing special. But if you get this far, you know you didn't screw anything up. You have a good base. Do git commit and start changing things. The ASP.NET Core app, we built our front end, now we want to build our back end. This is much easier. 2 ways you could do this. Way number 1, you use the command line, .NET New Web. I prefer empty projects because I love having clean slate, stuff that I can build on top of. There's a plethora of other ASP.NET templates you can use, but this will do all your work for you. The other way is you can go in Visual Studio if you prefer Visual Studio and do File New. The important thing is when you're done, you have 2 distinct directories because they're 2 distinct applications. Your front end is your Vue app, and your back end is your ASP.NET Core app. You could try to put the front end code somewhere inside of the back end. That's the way we used to do it with web forms or Razor pages. I don't recommend that. This is the approach that I think has worked best for us. So how does this ball work? Well, we built our scaffold, both our front end and our back end. So how exactly does the SPA work with Vue.js? When you start working with Vue.js, you are essentially serving up one HTML file, index.html. And this is what it looks like out of the gate. You can edit this to put in whatever you want to. If you want to add meta tags, if you want to change the title, if you want to have a funny picture when they don't have JavaScript enabled, you can do that. The 2 important things you need, well, really the 1 important thing you need is this line 18, that you have a div. This one's called app. And that's the div that Vue.js is going to put everything inside of. So anything inside app will be controlled by Vue.js. And then you have this line here at the end. And it doesn't necessarily have to be line 19. You can put stuff before it. But it's really the line before the body end tag. What Vue will do when you run a development server or you run a production build is any file that gets generated, or files, the script includes will get injected right here. Can't change that. It's just they're always going to be there. If you need to add other script tags, maybe I use Stripe for credit card processing. Well, I have to include a script tag for that. I put it up here. I can also put it down here in the bottom if I want to. Vue.js is going to reserve the line before the end body tag for any includes that it wants to do. All right, so this HTML gets served over to the browser. Browser renders it. It takes over the app div, and we create inside of that what we call a slot. And a slot is going to be whatever the current component is supposed to be loaded to memory. And this is done with a route. So you see my example here, my domain / route A. Well, Vue will know that whenever route A is in the address bar, it should load a certain view. Well, if I click on a link or I navigate to another route, or maybe I type another route up in the address bar, Vue takes that as a sign as I need to replace whatever is currently inside of that slot. And we can get unique with it. So the slot doesn't necessarily need to be the entire app. I could have a header and navigation bar outside of the slot that's always the same. And I just want to change the content inside of it. I could have sidebars, I can have footers, all that stuff can be a frame around the slot. So how do you tell Vue what components to use depending on the route? Well, this is where the Vue router comes into effect. And you'll get it by default if you use the CLI and tell it you want the router. If you forget to tell the Vue CLI that you want the router, you can always install it afterwards with a Vue.js plugin, and it will create all the scaffold code for you still. But this is all it looks like. You tell Vue you want to use the Vue router, and then you define a series of routes. So lines 9, 10, 11 is one route, 14, 15, 16 is another route. And we're just telling Vue that when you see the naked route, so just a slash, I want to go to a component called home, and I want to call it home. So two major things here. You want to give all your routes a name, because then you can reference them by name later in the application. This is useful. What if your routes change in the future? Because sometimes they do. Well, if you're referencing everything by name, the route path can change, but you don't have to find and replace throughout your code to figure out what needs to be updated. So in about, /about will load the about component. And it does it in a very special way, but I'll talk about that in just a sec. So the thing to know here, when this gets compiled by the development server or in production build, Vue is going to go through, look for everything that you're importing, every component you want to use. This is easy. This is 1, 2 components. Our apps have 50 plus components, different possible views that we can go to. So it's compiling all these into JavaScript files that will get delivered down to the browser at runtime. So when this page gets loaded, every view I have will get loaded at that moment. If you have 50 of them, that might take a few seconds. So what do you do if, all right, so yes, it loads all the components when the page renders, but you can use lazy loading, and this is a really good tip as you're designing your app. If there are some views that you don't want to have loaded when the page renders for the first time, you can lazy load them. And this is the syntax you have to use. Instead of just importing your component before the routes get defined, you set up a lambda that says, well, when we need the about component, go import it from some Webpack chunk. You don't need to say Webpack chunk name. The reason we would do this is because then I can look in my network stack and see all the different files. Because the file name that gets downloaded when we need this view will say something, something about. And it's easy to identify. So do this on pages that you are pretty sure people won't need every single time. These will get loaded on demand. All right, let's talk a little bit more about a Vue component. There are several ways to build Vue components. I'm only going to show you one because it's the most useful way to write single-page applications. The term we use is single file components. So if you go Google or Bing or whatever you use, view single file components, this is what it's going to show you. You've already seen this screenshot. You have your separate template, your separate styles, and your scripts. So this makes up one single component. We don't need to go much more into that. What does the development process look like? So we have our scaffold. We know how to use our command line. What does our process of pulling in our single page application and our .NET Core app, assuming we're doing some sort of data access? We have our browser, we have some network, this might be local. We have our ASP.NET Core app running on one port, and we have our VueJS app running on another port. That means if I'm running this locally, my VueJS app, for any AJAX request it makes, has to go to the network, to my ASP.NET Core app. So I have to tell it everywhere, here is the URL for the application that I'm running. Now this is just my personal opinion. I don't like this approach because I have two URLs that I'm managing. Whereas I am used to, in a web forms or a Razor world, everything's coming from the same URL. Even AJAX requests, I can just say, well, go get the data /API /something. What else do I need to worry about with two separate URLs? Policies, that's right, cross-domain. So if I'm developing an app or cross-domain or cross-origin policies, I now have to set one up for localhost. Because it's a different port, it's a different origin. So my Vue.js app will fail if it tries to make the request immediately. Unless I tell ASP.NET Core, let everything in, or you can let localhost 8081 in. I don't like that approach because that's not how it is in production. In production, my HTML is going to get served up from the same URL. My API calls are going to get served up from the same URL. So I want to mimic dev. I want dev to mimic prod as much as possible. What I wanted to do is look like this, where I have my browser talks to my ASP.NET Core app, but for any non-API call, I wanted to serve up the compiled Vue.js app. All right, so how do we do that in dev? All right, browser network. We have our ASP.NET Core app still running on a different port. We still have our Vue.js app running on a different port, but we create between them a proxy. And there are two ways you can do this. You can have the ASP.NET Core app proxy to the Vue.js app, or you can have the Vue.js app proxy to ASP.NET Core. This approach is the easiest in my opinion, going from ASP.NET Core to Vue.js. You can do it the other way, but this is easier for me. So what this means is, I open the browser, I type in localhost 14500, whatever your port is, and let's say I just want /, just give me index. Well, it's going to go to ASP.NET Core app. ASP.NET Core is going to say, I can't do anything with this. Well, instead of returning a 404, it's going to proxy or send it off to our Vue.js server running on a different port. Now, it's Vue.js's responsibility to return something. It will always return either index.html or the corresponding JavaScript CSS files. But this means no matter what I'm doing, I'm using the same URL every single time. Setting this up is trivial, but not documented. Like all good Microsoft features, you have to learn about this through a blog post that someone wrote on a whim a year and a half ago. There is a NuGet package called SPA Services Extensions, not just SPA Services. SPA Services is getting deprecated. SPA Services Extension is going to continue to be supported. There is an entire GitHub thread on this where people are livid, like most things. The way you use it, so we're talking ASP.NET Core 3. when you add that NuGet package, you get some new extension methods. Add spa static files. That's used specifically for production, but it says, when I go to production, if you need any spa files, go to www. And that should, because if you're working with .NET Core, that's where you get your public folders from. Add controllers. And then in configure, I just updated this for .NET Core 3. So you still set up your endpoints for MVC or for Web API, but you use spa static files for production. And then for development, we turn on use proxy to spa development server. Long-winded. You tell it the URL of where your Vue.js app is running. So the pipeline of any request coming in, if it's just an empty request or a request to a JavaScript file or CSS, it will go through. Is this something a controller can handle? No. Well, can the spa handle it? Let's send it off to Vue.js and let Vue.js handle it. The downside of this process, your development server will never return a 404. It will always, so if you have a request come in for an API that you're expecting ASP.NET to handle, and maybe you mistype it, you spell a controller name wrong or something. Web API, MVC, ASP.NET Core is not going to handle that, not going to return a 404 like you would expect it to, because it's going to send that off to the spa and it's going to let the spa handle it. And the worst case here is you get now a 404, you get index HTML. But then it's the responsibility of Vue.js to realize that is a bad URL and give you a 404 on the client side. I should have put a couple slides in there because I just thought about that is a common scenario that screws people up. All right, so you run your development server, you go into Visual Studio, hit run, and you're running your Vue.js app on your ASP.NET Core port. So, yay. I put that in there because that is a big thing that's not documented anywhere. So if you get these slides later, that'll tell you exactly what you need to do. So then in deployment, you first need to compile your Vue.js app using npm run build. This creates a distribution folder with everything you need inside of it. So you see I have a couple JS or CSS files. As your app gets bigger, this list gets longer. And you don't need to worry about what's in what. It's all going to be inside a distribution with index.html. Well, we want to copy that into our www folder in our ASP.NET Core app. Because when this gets deployed, that's where we're going to pull all of our public files from. So here, we're ignoring the is development, and by just saying use spa, it's going to automatically point that to www for every request that's not handled by ASP.NET Core. All right. Oh, little tip here. Inside of your Vue config, you can set your output directory. I always set that to my www folder right there. So when I do an npm run build, it automatically goes to the right place, and I don't have to add an extra step to do the copy. Now, you're probably doing this in some sort of continuous integration setup, so you might not have to worry about that. But if you're like me and every now and then you right-click deploy like they tell you not to, this saves you a little bit of time. And I threw this in here just as a sample slide. Webpack is kind of a beast, and there's a lot of different optimizations you can do. We use this in 2 of our client apps, and this worked really well for optimizing load times, just file sizes and whatnot. So if you want to copy that and play with it, I left it in there. That is very well documented on the other hand. All right, so how does Vue talk to ASP.NET Core? We have all this scaffolding set up. We know how to work in development. We know how to do in production. Yes, sir?
Before you move on, do you ignore your busy folder?
Yes, I do. Actually, what I'll do here in a second, I'll show you how I build it. The Vue.js scaffold will give you a git ignore, but it's only good for the Vue.js app. It's not good for the .NET Core app. So what I do is I'm still putting all these in the same repository. I don't have separate repositories for front and back end. I just have app. And what I do is I have a global git ignore that covers both the Vue app and the .NET Core app. I'll show you a little trick that I use to build them. All right, so you have everything running. You know how to do development. You know how to do deployments. How do you make Vue.js talk to ASP.NET Core? Because, I mean, you need data, right? You put stuff on the screen, you need the data to make it actually work or make it useful. This is one of the points where Vue is not opinionated. Angular is opinionated. You use Angular's HTTP provider. If you don't, we will give you trouble. Vue doesn't care. React doesn't care either, by the way, so I'm not trying to play partial. Vue doesn't have any built-in mechanism for making HTTP requests. So they say, well, use your own. It's current generation browsers is built in with Fetch. I prefer a tool called Axios, and this can be used with not just Angular, but React or Angular to an extent. But it's Fetch-based. It's a little bit easier to use, but it's just Ajax. I would suggest Fetch. Fetch is great because it's built in every browser, except that guy, I believe. So y'all don't have to support that guy, so do whatever you want. But this is how Axios works. You import the package. You say, I want to make a GET request, a POST request, put delete whatever to our URL. You can pass in metadata in these requests, but then you just handle the promise when it returns. So on some sort of success, you say, yay, success. On error, you yay or nay the error. So it's just really easy to use. But Fetch isn't that much different. There's others that are based off of JavaScript async await. I think Axios, I think they have a build that supports async await, but I don't know if they were there yet. It's been a while since I've checked. But this is a pretty well-known tool. In Vue.js land, this is heavily used, Axios. All right, so you get your data. Now we need to talk about state management. And more specifically, how do you share your state between components? Every component, if I go back to this earlier slide, I should have had it. All right, let me do this. Go back to this slide. All the state for this app, and I'm not even declaring any data here, is within the confines of this component. If I want this component to share any state with its child components, it has to physically pass it in. So you see here this hello world component. I'm passing in a message, hello to your Vue.js app. Well, the only way hello world is ever going to get that information is if I pass it in. Now I can declare it as part of my local state, pass it in that way, and that works. Well, what if hello world wants to pass information back up to this component? It can do that with events. So I can set up events to say, well, something happened, here's the data you need to know about. But that can get pretty cumbersome. Let me scroll back down here. So here's an example. I can declare some data on my component, and then I can just pass that to other components that might need to know it. So a higher level component can be the master source of truth for all state, and then pass it down to other components. This is really good for downstream data, so it's easy to pass data down the stack of components. It is not good for data coming back up. And it's not that it's hard to do, it's just cumbersome. You have to write the events that say, well, something happened. Here's the new data. then the other component says, all right, here's new data, all the way back up the component tree. I don't like this approach. You can also take the approach of each component goes and gets its data separately, but you might run into a scenario where you're duplicating tasks, you're repeating yourself. Not necessarily what you want to do. So I think just following this method for any large single-page applications is going to be difficult to keep state in sync. So that's why I don't spend too much time on it. Instead, I recommend another tool, such as Vue.JS, some sort of global state management library. In React, you have Redux. That's pretty well known. You can also use Redux with Vue. There's just not as many people doing that. And Vue.JS is this idea of centralized state management, where any component can ask for data or update data when it needs to, and everything stays in sync across the entire application lifecycle. So let's talk about the three fundamental aspects of Vue.JS. Vue.JS. We have state, obviously, but then we have actions and then mutations. And first time I used Vue.JS in Redux, it took me a couple times to really understand why I needed three different things to manipulate state. I just was of the opinion, can't I just have state and it works everywhere? No. First, let's talk about states. Specifically, state is just an object that can be made available to any Vue component that asks for it. And we have to predefine everything that we want to store in state. Not necessarily, but if you want change tracking, you want to predefine everything. So in Vue.JS, we tell it, this is the default state of my application. And you can put in whatever you want to. Integers, strings, objects, arrays. Here's an example. Now, all these different objects in our state will be managed. If I update global number, it will notify any component in my app that cares about global number that it's changed. So we get that two-way sync. Well, how do you update the state? Well, that's known as a mutation. So you're mutating the state of the app. And this is what necessarily notifies everything in the app that something's updated. And there's just simply methods. So here I have two methods. One's a success call, something good happened. One's an error call. Well, let's say I make that Axios request to our user API. We get back some user data. It's going to call our mutation that we successfully loaded user data. It will give us the current entire state of the app, but then it will also give us the new data that we just pulled back. Now, how do I know that's the way it goes? I should have put another slide in here, but we'll swing back here to Axios. Well, that's because I told it. And we'll talk about what commit is in a moment. But I want to call load user success, and I want to pass in the data from my response. Or load user error, something bad happened, and I want to pass in the error that occurred. That's how do we get into our mutation. So the method gets called, so the data passing in is that parameter that I passed. Error is the parameter that I passed. State is always given to me. Well, what's nice about this is because state represents the entire state of the app, I can change anything in there that I want to. So here, I'm just updating the array. I'm replacing the array of users. But in the error, I'm setting what was an empty string to probably a new string, but I'm also changing the global number. In Vue.JS, whenever a mutation runs, two things happen. First, there's a mutation snapshot. It's going to look at the entire state of your application. It's going to run the mutation. It's going to run another snapshot, and it compares the changes. Wherever the changes occur, users, error, load users, or global number, it's going to go notify any components that were subscribed to those changes. So the end result is you get two-way binding. It just updates in real time. But how do you call a mutation? So how do we get from the Axios request to this method call? Well, that's done with an action. And this is where I got kind of thrown off. It's like, why can't I just go from the Axios call directly to the mutation with it? Why do I need to have this action in between? Well, I don't know. The big reason is that an action can run multiple mutations. So you might have a couple different cases. So here, in order to even kick off the Axios call, I call an action called load users. I'm in a component, I tell it load users, and Vuex is going to give me this context object using object, what's it called? I don't remember what the term is. I'm going to take the commit method out of it, and I'm going to run my Ajax request, and I'm going to tell Vuex I want to commit to the load user success mutation some data, or I want to commit to the load user's error mutation some data. I can have multiple commits inside of an action. So maybe there's some different trees I can go down depending on the current state of the app. I can also, inside of my action, call other actions. It's not common, that's why I don't have an example of it. But normally your action does one thing and then serves back a result that updates the state of the app. So this action goes and does something, calls our mutation that changes the state of the app, and then we go tell all of our components about it. So how do we in our components map to the state that we care about? Because your state object might have 50, 100, 500 properties in it. You don't care about all of them. If you're on just the user view, you might just want to subscribe to 2 or 3 of them. Well, there's some shortcuts, some helpers built into Vuex, 2 in particular, map actions and map state. The map state helper, we tell it, well, I want to map this user's array in state, or the global number object in state, to a property that I call users or I call some number. And these register in the component as just data, as objects I can manipulate. So I can render them on the page. So my global number is some number. I can create a list of users. So for each user inside of users, let's write them out. Because this is mapped to Vuex state, if anything changes inside of users, that's going to bubble out to this component or any component that subscribes to users, and it's going to update that part of the template. Same thing with some number. If global number changes, it's going to reflect here and update the state of this template on the page. So you start getting this two-way binding. That's one side of the equation. The other side is, well, what if I want to be the one that initiates the change in state? Well, that's done with map actions. And inside of map actions, you just tell it, what actions do you care about? And this is done with an array, where you tell it, I want to create a method called load users. And this creates in the local view context, the component context, a method called load users. So if I, in one of my methods, say, all right, local load, it's going to go to Vuex and say, I want to initiate the action load users. It kicks off the Axios request, go get some data. Data comes back. If it's successful, it goes to my mutation. My mutation changes the state. The state updates the local state of the component, and the template updates. Or if I get the error permutates it the same way. All right. One of the other big questions that we get when we get down the line is about authentication. This is the responsibility of ASP.NET Core. There's 2 methods for authentication most commonly used. There's the cookie authentication, which if you've built a web application anytime in the past 20 years, you know what cookie authentication is. Works well for same domain systems. ASP.NET Core's had it forever, even though it's changed with every iteration of ASP.NET. Cookies are automatically sent to the server on any request. So if you're making AJAX requests or API requests, you send the cookie along with it. This is really useful. It's easy to revoke a cookie. So if you have a bad actor, you say, all right, we got to kick them out of the system, you can revoke their cookie. The other way to authenticate is with a JWT, or a JSON Web Token. This is, in the States, we call it the new hotness, which means everyone's using it, but doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It's really useful if you're doing cross-domain work. So if you have one domain for your API and another for your client-side app, it's easier to pass a token for authentication than it is to try to pass a cookie. They're also JSON-based. So if you want to add metadata to your token, maybe what roles is the user currently in? What's the user's email address? You can put that in the token, and it's encrypted. It's not hashed, but it's encrypted. So the client or anyone that knows how to decrypt a JWT can read all that metadata. So don't put personal information in those. They're also not sent to the server by default. Any request that you make to a web service and you want to send a JWT, you have to add it to the request. Something you learned the hard way the first time you started using them. In ASP.NET Core, you can create JWTs really easily. It's built-in support. However, there's no processes for revoking them or refreshing the tokens. A token like a cookie has a defined expiration date. Cookies are a little bit easier to renew if you need to refresh them. JWTs are not. You have to write all that logic yourself. Unless they have changed that in ASP.NET Core 3, I don't think they have. Because we're using JWTs on one client app right now, and it works. It works really well. But we had to write all of our own refresh and revocation logic. And that's not fun. The other big thing to keep aware of, don't confuse authentication with authorization. I'm not Troy Hunt, so you go watch him if you want to talk about this stuff. The big rule I live by is don't trust anything on the client. If the client gives you a request, don't pretend like they know what they're talking about. Single page apps, you could potentially have every single view that the user could possibly see, whether they have permission or not. Now, it's up to you whether or not you want to provide data to those views. The HTML is just purely a template. It doesn't matter if my user can see the template for an edit screen. If they don't have permission to actually edit or get the information for the screen, there's nothing they can do. So we make sure that we do our best on the client side to make sure that people can't accidentally see views they're not allowed to do anything with. But on the server, we're especially making sure that we authorize all over the place, or authorizing by role. So if you're not familiar with ASP.NET Core authentication and authorization, take a few minutes. It's really easy to do and protect all your different endpoints. So, all right. And handle your errors. This is the other big one. If you are doing the correct stuff on the server, you're sending back good HTTP responses, 404s, 500s, 502s, you name it. Make sure on your client you're handling errors, and you're telling the person that an error occurred. If they don't have permission to do something, you're returning a 403. And if you see a 403, tell them they don't have permission to do something. But let the server always be the single point of truth for anything that's happening. All right. I don't have time to go deep into it, but I have a sample spa that I built for a lot of these examples on GitHub. I'll also have the slides up there. And that's right on time. Let me show you the git ignore stuff I promised I'd show you. And I will gladly answer any questions anyone has if they want to ask them. Gitignore.io. I love this tool. You go in here, just say what you're using. So I'm using Vue, I'm using Vue.JS, I'm using Visual Studio. Basically anything .NET falls under that category. Or VS Code. Create, boom. Copy and paste that into your gitignore. And this will cover all your bases. What's even nice about it is it gives you the URL. So if you need to make changes to it in the future, you don't have to you don't have to figure out what's changed. You can just copy and paste this into the new gitignore. But this is what we use. And they actually have a command line interface, so you can build this at the command line. All right, so that's my little tidbit. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me today. Let's go party. And I hope you enjoy the rest of NDC.